The moment I realized my family no longer wanted me, there was not even a chair waiting for me at the table. I wish I could say it happened during a dramatic argument or some unforgettable family crisis. It did not. It happened on an ordinary Sunday evening. My name is Margaret Lawson. I was 69 years old, widowed, and living alone in the same house where I had raised my son, Daniel. For years, I told myself that the distance growing between us was normal. Children get busy. Families change. Life moves on. At least that was what I kept repeating whenever another holiday invitation arrived late or another phone call went unanswered. That Sunday, I baked Daniel's favorite apple pie from scratch. The recipe was older than he was. I packed it carefully into a carrier, drove 20 minutes across town, and arrived at his house just before dinner. Through the front window, I could see everyone gathered around the dining table. Daniel was laughing. My grandchildren were talking over each other. Heather, my daughter-in-law, was placing dishes on the table. For a moment, the sight warmed my heart. Then I stepped inside. "Hi, everyone," I said with a smile. Several people looked up. Daniel greeted me politely. The grandchildren waved. Heather smiled too, but something felt different. I stood there holding the pie while everyone returned to what they were doing. After a few awkward seconds, I realized there was a problem. Every seat at the table was already occupied. I looked around, expecting someone to bring another chair from the kitchen. No one moved. Finally, Heather glanced at me and said, "Oh, we did not think you would stay long." The room went strangely quiet. She said it casually, almost cheerfully, as if she were commenting on the weather. I laughed softly because I did not know what else to do. "I drove over for dinner," I replied. Heather shrugged. "Well, we can probably find something." Probably. The word landed harder than it should have. Daniel stared down at his plate. He did not say a thing. Not one word. A few minutes later, someone brought a folding chair from the garage. They squeezed it into a narrow space near the end of the table beside a stack of storage boxes that had not been put away. I sat down and thanked them. Then I spent the next hour pretending nothing was wrong. I smiled. I asked the grandchildren about school. I complimented the meal. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Inside, something had shifted. Families do not accidentally forget a chair. Families do not accidentally make room for everyone except one person. As dinner continued, I noticed little things I had ignored for years. Private jokes I did not understand. Stories I had never heard. Plans for upcoming weekends that nobody had mentioned to me. I was sitting at the table, yet somehow I felt miles away from everyone else. When I finally left that evening, I carried the empty pie dish back to my car and sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself not to overthink it. But deep down, I already knew the truth. And what happened later that night was far worse than a missing chair. When I got home that night, the silence felt heavier than usual. My house had been quiet ever since my husband passed away 6 years earlier, but this was different. This silence seemed to be asking questions I had spent years avoiding. I set the pie dish in the sink, hung my coat by the door, and stood in the kitchen staring at the clock above the refrigerator. It was only 8:30 in the evening. Somehow it felt much later. I made a cup of tea and sat at the small table near the window. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalk. Everything looked ordinary. Yet I could not stop thinking about that folding chair. Not because it was uncomfortable. Not because Heather had made a careless comment. It bothered me because it was not an isolated moment. It was part of a pattern I had spent years excusing. As I sat there, memories began surfacing one after another. 3 years earlier, I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner at my house. Daniel called 2 days before and said they had decided to spend the holiday elsewhere. Heather's family was having a gathering. They promised to stop by later. They never did. The turkey sat untouched in my refrigerator for nearly a week. The year after that, my birthday arrived without a single visit. Daniel texted me late that evening. Heather never contacted me at all. I told myself people were busy. Last Christmas, I mailed gifts to all 4 grandchildren. Only one thank you message ever came back. Even then, I defended them. I always defended them. The next morning, I woke up determined not to dwell on the previous evening. I cleaned the house, watered my plants, and drove to the grocery store. Life had to continue. But around noon, my phone rang. For a brief second, I hoped it was Daniel calling to apologize. Instead, it was my neighbor Susan Parker. Susan had lived across the street for almost 20 years. She was one of those rare people who noticed everything without being nosy. Margaret, she said. Are you free for lunch? We met at a small diner a few miles away. Halfway through the meal, Susan looked at me carefully and asked a question nobody else had dared ask. Are you happy with how your family treats you? I laughed softly. That is a strange question. Maybe, she said. But I have watched you make excuses for them for years. Her words stayed with me long after lunch ended. That evening, I opened my social media account and saw photographs from a family outing at a lake 2 weekends earlier. Daniel was there. Heather was there. The grandchildren were there. Even some distant relatives had attended. I had never been invited. I stared at the pictures for a long time. Then I quietly closed my laptop. For the first time, I stopped asking why they forgot me. Instead, I started wondering whether they had forgotten me at all. The answer came sooner than I expected. About 2 weeks after that lunch with Susan, Daniel called and asked if he and Heather could stop by my house. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. For a moment, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe they had realized how distant things had become. Maybe they wanted to reconnect. I spent the morning cleaning, even though the house was already clean. I baked cookies for the grandchildren, even though they were not coming. Old habits are difficult to break. When Daniel and Heather arrived that afternoon, they brought smiles, compliments, and a level of friendliness I had not seen in years. Heather admired my flower garden. Daniel asked about my health. We sat in the living room drinking coffee while making small talk. Everything felt strangely rehearsed. Eventually, Heather placed her cup on the table and exchanged a glance with Daniel. The atmosphere changed immediately. Margaret, Daniel began, we wanted to talk to you about something important. I nodded. Of course. He leaned forward. We have been thinking about your future. That sentence alone made me uneasy. Heather quickly jumped in. We just want to make sure you are taken care of. I smiled politely. That is kind of you. Then Daniel pulled a folder from his briefcase. The moment I saw it, I understood this visit was not about family. It was about paperwork. What is that? I asked. Nothing complicated, Heather said. Just some documents that would make things easier down the road. Daniel opened the folder and slid several pages across the coffee table. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked down. The language was formal. Legal. Several sections referenced property ownership. My property ownership. Slowly, I turned another page. Then another. The more I read, the quieter I became. The documents would transfer significant control of my house into a trust managed primarily by Daniel. My stomach tightened. Why would I sign this? I asked calmly. Daniel shifted in his seat. It is just planning ahead. Heather smiled. You never know what might happen in the future. I looked at both of them. I am healthy. Of course you are, Heather replied quickly. This is simply being practical. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I carefully placed the papers back on the table. I am not signing anything today. The friendliness disappeared so quickly, it almost startled me. Heather's smile faded. Daniel looked disappointed rather than concerned. It was a subtle change, but impossible to miss. The conversation never fully recovered after that. They stayed another 20 minutes, but the warmth was gone. When they finally left, the folder remained on my coffee table. I stood by the front window and watched their car pull away. Then I looked down at the documents again. For years, I had worried about being forgotten. Sitting there alone in my living room, a different possibility entered my mind. What if forgetting me was never the problem? What if they only remembered me when they needed something? After that afternoon, something changed inside me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It was more like a curtain slowly being pulled back. Once I had seen what was behind it, I could not pretend anymore. The folder remained in a drawer in my desk, but I thought about it often. Not because I was considering signing it. Because it forced me to look honestly at everything that had happened over the previous few years. The phone calls became less frequent after I refused. The invitations almost disappeared entirely. Daniel still sent occasional text messages, but they felt more like obligations than conversations. Heather stopped reaching out altogether. Weeks passed, then months. Summer turned into fall. The leaves outside my living room window changed color and drifted across the lawn. Most mornings followed the same routine. I watered my flowers, read the newspaper, and drank coffee while watching the neighborhood wake up. The quiet became familiar. What surprised me was how lonely that quiet could feel. One Saturday morning, I attended my granddaughter's soccer game. Nobody had invited me. I learned about it from a community calendar online. I sat in the bleachers nearly 50 yards away from the rest of the family. They never noticed I was there. I watched my granddaughter score a goal and run toward her parents with a huge smile on her face. I wanted to walk over and congratulate her. Instead, I stayed where I was. As families packed up their chairs and coolers afterward, I quietly returned to my car and drove home. That evening, I stood in the kitchen holding a photograph from years earlier. Daniel was 8 years old in the picture. His front teeth were missing. His baseball cap was too big for his head. He was smiling at me as though I were the most important person in the world. I sat at the table and stared at that photograph for a long time. Sometimes grief does not come from losing someone. Sometimes it comes from watching them slowly disappear while they are still alive. A few days later, Susan stopped by unexpectedly with a container of homemade soup. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. We sat on the back porch as the sun began to set. "You look tired," she said gently. I smiled. "I am fine." Susan shook her head. "Margaret, you always say that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I surprised myself. "I think I am losing my family," I said quietly. The words hung in the air between us. Saying them out loud made them feel real. Susan reached over and squeezed my hand. She did not offer advice. She did not try to fix anything. She simply sat beside me while the sky turned orange and then gray. That night, after she left, I walked through my empty house room by room. For the first time in my life, I truly believed I might spend the rest of my years alone. And that thought nearly broke me. 3 days after that conversation with Susan, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight. Sleep had become difficult. The house felt too quiet, and my thoughts were too loud. I had spent months convincing myself that things would eventually improve. Families go through difficult seasons. Relationships become strained. People get distracted. Those explanations had comforted me for a long time. Now they felt hollow. The next morning, I followed my usual routine. I made coffee, checked the mail, and watered the plants near the front porch. Most days brought nothing more exciting than grocery store advertisements and utility bills. That day was different. Among the envelopes was a thick cream-colored letter with a law firm's name printed in the corner. I did not recognize it. At first, I assumed it was some kind of marketing material. I nearly set it aside without opening it. Something made me pause. Carrying the envelope inside, I sat down and carefully unfolded the contents. The first page contained a formal introduction from an attorney named Michael Grant. My eyes moved slowly across the words. By the second paragraph, I stopped breathing for a moment. The letter referenced my older sister, Eleanor. My sister had passed away almost 2 years earlier. We had been close as children, but adulthood had taken us to different states and different lives. We stayed in touch through holiday calls, birthday cards, and occasional visits. Losing her had been one of the hardest experiences of my life. I continued reading. According to the letter, Michael Grant had spent months attempting to locate me. Several documents required my immediate attention regarding matters connected to Eleanor's estate. My first reaction was confusion. Eleanor's affairs had supposedly been settled long ago. Why would an attorney contact me now? I turned to the next page. There were references to trust documents, financial accounts, and property records. The legal language was difficult to follow, but one sentence stood out clearly. I was listed as the primary beneficiary. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I read it again. The room suddenly felt very still. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the remaining pages. There had to be some mistake. Eleanor had children of her own. She had grandchildren. Surely they would inherit anything she left behind. Yet every page seemed to confirm the same thing. Michael Grant was requesting a meeting because important matters concerning Eleanor's estate remained unresolved, and I was the person legally entitled to receive the information. For nearly an hour, I sat alone at the table staring at the documents. Outside, cars passed through the neighborhood, and children rode bicycles down the street. Life continued as normal. Inside my kitchen, everything felt different. After months of feeling invisible, forgotten, and pushed aside, an unexpected letter had arrived carrying questions I never imagined asking. And deep down, I sensed that whatever Michael Grant was about to tell me would change the course of my life in ways I could not yet understand. 2 days later, I drove to Michael Grant's office with a folder full of questions and very few expectations. The building was located in a quiet business district about 30 miles from my home. As I walked through the glass doors, I felt nervous in a way I had not experienced for years. Part of me still believed there had been some misunderstanding. Another part was afraid to hope for anything at all. A receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room overlooking a small park. A few minutes later, Michael Grant entered carrying several files. He looked professional but kind, the sort of person who understood that legal matters often involved much more than paperwork. After introducing himself, he sat across from me and opened a folder. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "before we discuss the details, I want to tell you that your sister spoke about you often." My throat tightened immediately. "She did." Michael nodded. "Very often." For a moment, memories of Eleanor came rushing back. We had shared a bedroom as children. We had written letters to each other when we lived in different states. Even after life became busy, there was never any doubt that we loved each other. Michael carefully slid several documents across the table. "Your sister created a long-term estate plan years before her passing," he explained. "She updated it multiple times. In every version, she made one thing very clear." I looked down at the papers. My name appeared repeatedly. "I do not understand," I said quietly. "She had her own family." Michael folded his hands. "She did, and she provided for them separately during her lifetime. However, she believed you spent decades putting other people first while rarely receiving the same consideration in return." I stared at him in silence. "There is more," he continued. "Your sister left written instructions explaining her decision." He handed me a sealed envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Tears filled my eyes before I even finished the first paragraph. She wrote about our childhood. She wrote about the sacrifices I made caring for our parents. She wrote about the years I spent supporting my husband and raising Daniel. Then I reached the sentence that changed everything. Eleanor wrote that she wanted me to have the freedom to enjoy the years ahead without worrying about money, obligations, or anyone else's expectations. By the time I reached the end of the letter, I could barely see the page through my tears. Michael waited patiently before speaking again. "The estate includes financial investments, a vacation property, and several accounts that have grown significantly over time." I looked up in disbelief. "How significant?" Michael gave me a number. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had heard him incorrectly. The amount was far beyond anything I had imagined. My entire life, I had worried about stretching retirement savings and paying bills responsibly. Suddenly, the future looked completely different. As I left the office that afternoon, the sun seemed brighter than it had in months. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: hope. The changes began so subtly that I almost missed them. A week after my meeting with Michael Grant, Daniel called me twice in the same day. That alone was unusual. For months, sometimes weeks would pass without a conversation. Now he suddenly wanted to know how I was feeling, whether I needed help with anything, and if I had any plans for the weekend. At first, I tried not to read too much into it. After all, I had spent years hoping my son would reach out more often. But then other things started happening. Heather sent me a text message complimenting my garden. 2 days later, she mailed a card thanking me for always being such a supportive grandmother. I stared at that card for a long time. In nearly 15 years of knowing Heather, I could not remember receiving a handwritten note from her. The following Sunday, Daniel invited me to dinner. Unlike the last gathering, there was a chair waiting for me before I even arrived. My favorite dessert was on the table. The grandchildren were encouraged to sit beside me. Everyone seemed unusually attentive. Outwardly, it looked like everything I had wanted for years. Yet something felt different. Something felt rehearsed. As dinner continued, I noticed small details. Heather kept asking questions about my future plans. Daniel wanted to know whether I had spoken to any financial advisors recently. One of the questions seemed innocent by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Nobody directly mentioned money. Nobody asked about my sister's estate. Yet I could feel the conversation circling around something they already suspected. A few days later, Susan stopped by for coffee. After listening to my observations, she leaned back in her chair and raised an eyebrow. "Do they know?" she asked. "Know what?" I replied. "About your inheritance." I stared into my coffee cup. "I have not told them anything." Susan nodded slowly. Then somebody did. Her words stayed with me. Over the next several weeks, the attention continued. Daniel called regularly. Heather invited me to family activities. Photographs suddenly appeared online showing me included in gatherings where I had previously been ignored. To an outsider, it would have looked like a happy family reconnecting. The strange thing was that nobody ever apologized. Nobody acknowledged the years of distance. Nobody mentioned the lonely holidays, the forgotten birthdays, or the folding chair from the garage. It was as if they expected me to erase the past simply because they were being kind in the present. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork for Michael Grant's office, I received another call from Daniel. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Heather and I were thinking," he said, "maybe we should all get together for a special family dinner next Friday." I smiled politely, even though he could not see it. "That sounds nice." There was a brief pause. Then he added, "There are some important things we would like to discuss." The moment he said those words, I knew exactly where the conversation was heading. Friday evening arrived with surprising calm. A few months earlier, I would have spent the entire day worrying about whether I was welcome. This time, I felt something different. Clarity. I drove to Daniel and Heather's house just before 6 o'clock and noticed several extra cars already parked along the curb. When I walked inside, I immediately realized this was not an ordinary family dinner. Relatives I had not seen in months were gathered in the living room. My grandchildren greeted me enthusiastically. Heather hurried over with a bright smile and offered to take my coat. Daniel seemed unusually attentive. Everything was polished. Everything was pleasant. Everything felt carefully arranged. During dinner, the conversation stayed light. People talked about work, school, vacations, and local events. Heather laughed often. Daniel refilled my glass before I could ask. Anyone looking at the table would have assumed we were a close family enjoying a perfect evening together. Yet beneath the surface, I could feel anticipation building. They were waiting for something. Eventually, dessert was served. As coffee cups appeared, the room grew quieter. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mom," he said, "we have all been thinking about how important family is." Several heads nodded around the table. Heather smiled warmly. "Especially as we get older," she added. I listened without interrupting. Daniel continued, "Life is unpredictable. That is why planning ahead matters so much." There it was. The conversation had finally arrived where I knew it was heading. He spoke for several minutes about security, family unity, and making wise decisions. Heather added comments about protecting future generations. Not once did either of them mention my sister's estate directly. They did not have to. Every sentence pointed toward the same subject. Finally, Daniel looked at me. "Mom, we were hoping to talk about your long-term plans." The room became very still. I set down my coffee cup and looked around the table. Faces watched me expectantly. Some appeared curious. Others seemed uncomfortable. Then I asked the only question that truly mattered. "Before we discuss my future," I said quietly, "can someone explain why I became important again?" Silence filled the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Heather's smile faded first. Daniel stared at the table. I continued calmly. "Was it before or after people learned about my sister's estate?" The silence grew even heavier. Several relatives exchanged glances. One person looked down at their plate. Another shifted uneasily in their chair. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed to have a prepared response. I was not angry. I was not accusing anyone. I simply wanted honesty. After years of excuses, half-truths, and avoidance, I wanted one truthful conversation. And judging by the expressions around the table, that was exactly what nobody had expected me to ask. For several long seconds, nobody answered my question. The silence itself told me more than words could have. Daniel looked at Heather. Heather looked down at her coffee cup. Around the table, relatives suddenly found great interest in their desserts. I felt no satisfaction watching their discomfort. I only felt tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of wondering. Tired of carrying the entire weight of the relationship while everyone else decided when I mattered. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Mom, it is not like that." I nodded slowly. "Then explain it to me." His mouth opened, then closed again. There was nothing easy to say because the truth had been sitting at the table with us all evening. Heather cleared her throat. "We have all been busy." I almost smiled. For years, that had been the answer. Busy during birthdays. Busy during holidays. Busy during soccer games. Busy during long stretches when I sat alone waiting for a phone call. "I understand people get busy," I said gently. "What I do not understand is why the busyness seemed to disappear right after people learned I inherited something." No one challenged the observation. No one could. The room remained quiet until one of my grandchildren broke the tension by asking an innocent question about dessert. The moment passed, but the truth remained. Later that evening, as guests prepared to leave, Daniel walked me to my car. The night air was cool. For the first time in years, we spoke honestly. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. He stared at the driveway for a moment. "For not being there. For letting distance become normal." I believed he meant it. Whether guilt, regret, or love had finally broken through, I could not say. Perhaps it was a little of all three. I touched his arm gently. "I love you, Daniel." That never changed. His eyes filled with emotion. "I love you too, Mom." A few months later, the estate matters were finalized. The inheritance was real. Life-changing, certainly, but not in the way people might imagine. I did not buy a mansion. I did not buy expensive cars. I did not spend my days proving anyone wrong. Instead, I used the gift the way Eleanor hoped I would. I paid off every remaining debt. I created education funds for my grandchildren because I wanted them to have opportunities, regardless of the mistakes their parents made. I donated to several local charities that supported older adults living alone. Most importantly, I purchased a small cottage near the ocean, a place I had dreamed about since I was a young woman. The first evening I spent there, I sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon. Waves rolled gently across the shoreline. Seagulls drifted overhead. For the first time in many years, my future felt larger than my past. Daniel and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. Heather became more respectful. Trust took time, but healing often does. Looking back, I realized something important. The greatest gift Eleanor left me was not financial freedom. It was perspective. I had spent years believing my worth depended on how much I gave to others. Standing beside the ocean that evening, I finally understood the truth. My worth had been there all along. I did not reach the end of my life when everything fell apart. I simply reached the beginning of a chapter where I finally learned how to value myself.